Have you ever wondered why someone as righteous and faithful as Job had to face so much suffering? What leads God to allow a man who dedicated his life to following his teachings to be struck by so many tragedies? In this video, we'll explore the story of Job, one of the most impactful stories in the Bible, and understand how his suffering not only challenged faith, but also forever changed the way we view the purpose of suffering. Get ready for a deep reflection on faith, pain, and redemption that will surprise you. Stay with me until the end and discover what truly lies behind this extraordinary Bible story. Job, a man of unwavering faith and irreproachable life, was respected throughout the land of Uz, where he was born and raised. His name was synonymous with justice and prosperity, and his reputation spread like a gentle breeze, touching everyone who crossed his path. From a young age, he had been taught to follow God's ways, to honor his commandments, and to live a righteous life. His heart was in tune with the divine creation, and his skilled and diligent hands transformed the fertile land into a true paradise. The abundance he possessed was not the result of luck or chance, but of a life of hard work and, above all, devotion to God. On his vast lands, the sound of sheep and cattle, the golden fields, and the trees laden with fruit symbolized the success Job had achieved. His material wealth seemed infinite, but what stood out most was his deep love for his family. He was a father to sons and daughters who together formed a large and harmonious family. In every smile, in every laugh shared at the table, Job saw God's hand in his life. He gave thanks to God for the blessing of having healthy children who grew in wisdom and virtue, spreading goodness wherever they went. His home, a solid and imposing structure, was a center of hospitality. Often, other inhabitants of Uz came seeking advice, and Job received them with patience and generosity. He had become a leader, not only because of his material wealth, but because of the wisdom he imparted. He was known for listening attentively and offering words of comfort, instructing others on how to live a just life. But above all, what truly defined Job was his relationship with God. Every day, without fail, Job would approach the altar of his home. There, he offered sacrifices, not only for his own sins but for those of his children, hoping to protect them from any harm that might arise. He feared that, in moments of fun or distraction, his children might unknowingly transgress divine laws. So, with a heart full of humility, he asked God for forgiveness for his mistakes and theirs, knowing that life is fragile and that God's goodness was the only thing that could keep them safe. And so, in the calm of the morning and the serenity of the starry nights, Job's life flowed like a peaceful river. He didn't seek fame, but his name was sung by all who knew him. He lived the life everyone admired, but little did he know that he was about to be challenged in ways he could never have predicted. His perfect balance, his faith, and his wealth would be tested in unimaginable ways, and the man who seemed to have everything would face a storm that threatened to engulf everything he held dear. Although Job was a man of vast wealth and success, he did not feel secure or complete in his life of blessings without first ensuring that his soul and his family were at peace with God. At dawn, before anything else, he would retire to his private altar, a small structure made of stones that he had built with his own hands. There, in the silence of the morning, as the sun began to rise on the horizon, Job would kneel, his forehead touching the ground, and offer his prayers to God. These prayers were not only for his own life or well-being, but for everyone around him, especially his children. Each of them, in their festivities or banquets, might commit a mistake, perhaps without realizing it. That's why Job never ceased to intercede, fearing that some sin might go unconfessed. He knew that, although his life was pure, human fragility was something to consider. He saw himself as a guardian, not only of his wealth, but of the spiritual integrity of his family. Each new day, he made sacrifices on behalf of his children, burning incense and offering the best of his flocks in search of divine forgiveness. These were not just words spoken in the wind, but a sincere act of reverence and responsibility. For Job, these offerings were not a simple formality, but a gesture of devotion and trust, an attempt to keep his house under God's protection, warding off any evil that might arise unexpectedly. With the same zeal, he instructed his children, always reminding them of the importance of living in harmony with divine principles. But Job also knew he couldn't control the hearts of everyone. Thus, he made the sacrifice with the hope that, by doing his part, God would honor his devotion and protect those he loved. He did not fear the adversities of life, but the unknown that could occur when God's true justice met human error. Amidst the daily struggles and the blessings that accumulated in his life, Job's heart remained focused on high, seeking the favorable mercy of God. Every sacrifice he made was not just an act of worship, but a way of reinforcing his trust in the Lord, demonstrating that his prosperity was not by his own merit, but by the grace and protection he sought tirelessly, day after day. Deep down, he knew that what made his life rich wasn't his material possessions, but his unwavering faith in God and his sincere desire to please him with everything he had. One day, when the sky seemed clear and the earth calm, a heavenly meeting took place in the high heavens. All the divine beings were present, with God's angels gathered before his throne. Among them, however, was one who did not share the purity of the others, Satan the accuser, who walked among the angels with a shrewd look, hiding a dark desire in his heart. He watched the earth intently, and his ever-hungry gaze fell upon Job, the righteous and prosperous man. Suddenly, Satan, with his tongue poisoned by suspicion, addressed the Lord in a tone of challenge, seeking to test the limits of human loyalty. "You say that Job is righteous and fears you, but he only worships you because you've blessed him abundantly," said Satan, with a cruel smile. "Take away his riches, take away what he holds most dear, and you will see how his faith vanishes like a mist at dawn. He only serves you because life smiles upon him." God, with a calm that contrasted with the tension spreading, looked at Satan. He knew Job's heart was sincere, that his devotion was not based on possessions or favors, but on true faith. But God also knew that the man he had created, whom he loved so much, needed to be tested. The trust in Job was not empty. God knew he was faithful, but for the truth of his faith to be revealed, something more was needed. Something that would shake even the firmest foundations of his life. Satan, observing God's confidence, insisted, challenging, "Then allow me, Lord, to take everything he has, and you'll see how, in his pain, he will curse you." It was a subtle but treacherous temptation, a battle between good and evil. He wanted to prove that Job's loyalty was fragile, that his worship was just a reward for the prosperity he enjoyed. God, fully trusting his servant, accepted the challenge. "You may do what you want with everything he has, but do not take his life," said God with authority, allowing the trial to begin. Without hesitation, Satan left the heavenly domain with a victorious smile, already preparing the storm that would fall upon the faithful man of Uz. In the spiritual battlefield, the man who was about to face an unimaginable trial did not yet know that his life of blessings was about to be turned upside down. The storm was about to begin, and Job's path to redemption would go through deep suffering, but also through a revelation of the true strength of his faith. As Satan withdrew from the heavenly throne, the atmosphere on earth seemed calm, as if nothing would disturb the harmony in Job's life. But in the heavens, a divine command had been given. God, in his infinite wisdom, allowed the test to begin. The Lord knew that Job's true faith was not in material blessings, but in the pure heart that led him to live according to his teachings. Job's trust in God would be tested in a way no human could have ever imagined, but the Creator, who knows the hearts, never doubted his faithfulness. In the land of Uz, Job's life, once peaceful and prosperous, was about to change. On an ordinary day, just like any other, the winds of adversity began to blow. First, a messenger ran to him, his eyes wide with fear. "Job, Lord, there has been an attack. The Sabaeans came and took your cattle, killing your servants," he said, breathing heavily, as though the words were torn from his chest. Before Job could process the gravity of the news, another messenger arrived, his eyes filled with despair. "Job, a celestial fire fell and consumed your sheep and shepherds. There is nothing left." And one after another, more messengers came, bringing news of calamities. The Chaldeans had stolen his camels, and worse still, a fierce wind had collapsed the house of his children, killing them instantly. With every word, Job's world seemed to crumble beneath his feet, but God, in his wisdom, knew this was necessary. It was a test of Job's heart. He needed to show man that his faith was not anchored in possessions, but in the unwavering trust in the Lord, no matter how strong the storms life could throw at him. Job, deep within himself, still believed that all he had was a divine gift. Even in the face of sudden and incomprehensible destruction, he did not question the reason for the tragedy. He trusted that God knew what was best, even when the loss seemed unbearable. God had allowed pain and suffering to invade his life, but he had not abandoned him. It was only the beginning of a test, and Job, unknowingly, was about to become an eternal example of true faithfulness to God in the midst of adversity. Although everything around him was falling apart, Job's faith remained firm. He didn't understand the pain, but he trusted that God, who had allowed everything to be taken from him, knew what he was doing. And with that trust, he was about to do something no one could imagine. He was preparing to face the greatest of tests, the test of the soul, where the response to tragedy could reveal the truth of his heart. Chaos had settled in Job's life, but he still didn't know the full weight of the storm that would strike him. In a single day, everything he had built with so much effort, everything he loved and cherished, was ripped from his hands in a relentless and cruel manner. Job didn't understand, but his faith, still firm and unbreakable, remained. He could have despaired, could have cursed existence, but something inside him kept him standing. He knew that nothing, not even the deepest tragedy, could erase God's goodness. He didn't know why all this had happened, but he trusted that the reason was beyond his understanding. Without allowing himself to fall into despair, he withdrew to a quiet place where he could reflect on the pain and the loss. He knew that what remained now was his faith and his surrender to God, for the loss of material wealth could be restored. But what touched him most was the loss of his children, whose laughter and lives would never return. Even with his soul torn apart, he bowed, his head to the ground, and wept, but without losing his reverence. He knew that, no matter how deep his suffering, God remained worthy of all worship. And so, in that moment of profound pain, he already demonstrated the strength that few could comprehend. The true faith, the one that remains intact even when the world around you falls apart. This loss of everything he had would not be the end of his story, but the beginning of a path of suffering that would reveal his true greatness of spirit. Job didn't know it, but something inside him was changing. He was beginning to understand that, even in the midst of tragedy, his connection with God would be the only solid foundation upon which he could rebuild his life. After the devastating impact of losing everything he loved, Job found himself alone, but not in despair. His house, once full of laughter and light, was now silent, immersed in an endless mourning. His children were gone, his fortune gone, and his servants fallen. But in the midst of this immense darkness, something deeply human and spiritually sublime emerged in Job. The moment he received the final news, the bitterest of all, he tore his clothes, an ancient gesture of profound mourning. It was as if every part of his being was being torn apart along with the fabric he ripped. But this pain did not make him lose his composure, and in his agony, he did not curse the heavens or life. He fell to the ground, and what followed was a scene that would echo through future generations, an image of unwavering faith in the face of the abyss. With his eyes filled with tears, he looked to the sky, to the God who seemed to have withdrawn, and spoke words that reverberated in his heart and in eternity. "Naked I came from my mother's womb, and naked I will return there. The Lord gave, and the Lord has taken away. Blessed be the name of the Lord." These words were not spoken as mere consolation or resignation, but as a profound affirmation of faith. Job didn't know why this was happening, but he knew that God was present. The tragedy that had befallen him would not shake his conviction that the Lord, who had given him everything, had the power and sovereignty to take it away. He did not give in to despair, did not let himself be consumed by anger or resentment. At that moment, Job was living a divine truth that few could understand. The faith that is not based on wealth or material blessings, but on absolute trust in God's character. His faith was not a bargain with heaven, not the worship of a man who only recognized the Lord when he had something to gain, but the worship of a servant who recognized that, even in his suffering, God was worthy of all glory. Job rose from the ground, his soul marked but not defeated. He was aware of the gravity of his pain, but he also knew that this pain, no matter how deep, did not define his relationship with God. He did not seek immediate explanations, nor did he blame anyone, not even God. He understood that the answer was beyond his understanding, but his trust in God's goodness remained unshaken. With his heart heavy and his eyes turned to the sky, Job felt the weight of his loss, but also the presence of the God who, despite allowing the tragedy, was still with him. He didn't know what would come next, but he knew that God was sovereign over all things. In his pain, Job revealed the greatest of all testimonies of faith, the trust that does not depend on circumstances, but on the certainty that in the midst of darkness, God remains faithful. Despite all the tragedy that had befallen Job, a deep silence took over his life. The wounds of his soul still bled, but he did not bend to despair. His faithfulness to God was more alive than ever, and even in the unbearable pain, he did not blame the Lord. But in the heavens above, a new game was about to unfold. Satan, who had been watching Job's response closely, knew that the man from Uz was still standing, still holding firm in his faith. The accuser, with his relentless spirit, was not satisfied. He wanted more. He wanted to see just how far Job's resistance would go. With a sly and wicked smile, Satan returned to God's throne, daring once again to challenge his confidence in the man he loved so much. "Do you see how Job still worships you?" said Satan sarcastically with disdain. "Yes, he lost his wealth and his children, but his life is still intact. Allow me to afflict his flesh, Lord, and you will see how he will finally curse you in his pain." He knew that, by touching Job's body, he could go deeper, possibly corrupting what remained of his faith. God, knowing the integrity of Job's heart and fully confident in his faithfulness, accepted the new challenge. "You may afflict him as you wish, but do not take his life," God said, allowing Satan to go further, now touching the body of the righteous man but not permitting death to reach him. God's trust in Job was unwavering, but the test was far from over. In the blink of an eye, evil took the form of physical pain. Job, who had already lost everything, saw his health destroyed by a terrible and unbearable disease. His body, once strong and healthy, was covered in painful ulcers, wounds that spread across his skin, leaving him debilitated and disfigured. Pain was a constant shadow over him, and distress seemed endless. He no longer knew if his suffering had any measure, as what he felt went beyond the physical. It was a torture that afflicted not only the body, but also the soul. Job found himself in a deplorable state. The wounds on his skin burned, and the incessant itching led him to use shards of pottery to try to relieve his pain. He sat in ashes, a broken man, exposed to misery. The position he found himself in symbolized his humiliation, his endless suffering. But although the pain consumed him, something within him resisted. He did not curse God. He did not deny his faith. Evil had gone far, but Job's loyalty was being tested deep within his being. Satan, in his cunning, hoped that this unbearable pain would be enough to make Job succumb. He wanted to see the righteous man break, fall at the feet of despair. But as Job's body withered and pain overtook every fiber of his being, an even deeper force, one that could not be touched by any physical pain, rose within him: unwavering trust in God. The trial was far from over, but Job, even covered in wounds and suffering indescribably, had not lost his faith. The road ahead was filled with uncertainties, but his trust in the Lord did not falter. Job's suffering reached unbearable levels. The ulcers covering his body were so large and painful that he could not move without feeling excruciating pain. His body was covered in sores, a sight that seemed more like the image of a defeated man. Yet paradoxically, it was the reflection of a resistance few could comprehend. The ulcers, which seemed endless, burned as if fire itself were being poured upon his flesh, and the unbearable itching made him tear at his skin in an attempt for relief. The pain offered no respite. There was no moment of peace. During the day, he crawled in search of some comfort, but there was none. At night, the wounds seemed to burn even more, as if sleep itself were an enemy. Job crawled through the ashes, using broken pottery shards to try to ease the pain that consumed him, but he found no relief. The body that was once full of vigor was now just an empty shell, marked by pain and physical suffering. But Job's suffering was not only physical. He was being torn apart from the inside, a man who had lost his family, his wealth, and now his health. The weight of loneliness seemed as heavy as the pain of the sores on his flesh. Life had abandoned him, and he was trapped in a suffering that gave him no rest. Job, who had once been a respected and blessed man, was now seen as a shadow of himself, a man whose appearance was so disfigured that no one would recognize him. The hours seemed to drag, and every movement, no matter how simple, required an immense effort. But deep down, there was something that refused to die inside him: his faith. Even in the face of physical suffering and crushing pain, Job did not give in to despair. His body was broken, but his soul remained unshakable. What troubled Job the most was not the physical pain itself, but the realization that his life had become a nightmare from which there was no waking. He wondered, in his tormented mind, why so much suffering? What had he done to deserve such pain? What more could be demanded of a man who had already lost everything? He still believed in God, but the question echoed in his soul: why did God allow such affliction? However, Job's physical suffering, as horrible and relentless as it was, did not lead him to lose hope. He endured the pain with a dignity few could understand, and his resilience in the face of everything he was enduring became a testimony of immeasurable faith. Job's struggle was visible not only in his wounds but also in his soul, which, even torn apart, had not yet surrendered. He did not know what was coming, but something kept him strong. The belief that, amid the deepest suffering, there was still a greater purpose, something he could not understand, but that somehow sustained him. The pain Job was experiencing was not his alone. His wife, who had shared moments of happiness, prosperity, and now tragedy with him, also felt the weight of the losses. She saw him there, covered in ulcers, in such a deplorable state that even the sunlight seemed incapable of touching him without causing more pain. The man she had known, the one who had everything and loved her with dedication, was being consumed by disease, pain, and hopelessness. The sight was more than she could bear. She watched him, with a broken heart and eyes filled with anguish, trying to find a solution to ease his pain. But there was nothing she could do. The man who had once been a solid rock now seemed like a shadow of himself, a man broken not only physically but spiritually as well. She felt, beside him, the weight of her own losses, her children, her wealth, the stability she had valued so much. Everything had been lost in an instant. In a moment of despair, and perhaps from a pain so great she could no longer control, her soul reacted with harsh words, words that came not from coldness, but from exhaustion, from continuous suffering, and from the lack of hope. She approached Job and said, with a trembling voice filled with anger at the fate that had crushed them, "Why do you still remain faithful to God? Look what has happened to us. Look at how we are. He has abandoned us. Why continue believing in a God who does not protect us? Curse the Lord and die, Job. What is the value of life if it only brings us suffering?" Job's wife, completely overcome by pain, no longer knew what to do with the cruel reality they were living. She wanted to see the end of the pain, not only for Job but for herself as well. She wanted everything to be resolved, for the suffering to end once and for all. And in her anguish, she thought that death might be the only possible end to so much pain. Job, with his exhausted body and soul marked by every blow life had dealt, listened to his wife's words and remained silent for a moment. The impact of those words weighed on his heart, but he knew that suffering could not be a justification for abandoning everything he believed in. He looked at her, and in the midst of pain, his words were like a silent response to the despair that consumed her. "You speak as a foolish woman," Job replied, his voice trembling with pain. "Shall we accept the good from God and not the bad? Why do you believe that suffering means God has abandoned us? The Lord gave, the Lord took away, and he is still worthy of our worship." Job's words were firm, not as a condemnation but as a reminder that, even in the deepest pain, faith should prevail. He was not blind to the reality of his suffering. He saw it clearly, but he also understood that, even in the face of tragedy, God's goodness should not be questioned. Suffering should not weaken his faith but strengthen it. Job knew that his wife did not speak with malice, but with the frustration of someone who could no longer bear the suffering beside her. He understood her, but at the same time, he knew it was necessary to keep his trust in the Lord, no matter the circumstances. The love and faith he had for God did not depend on material blessings or the absence of pain, but on something deeper, trust in his sovereignty and justice. Job's response was a testimony not only to his unwavering faith, but also to his deep understanding that life, with its pains and joys, is not controlled by circumstances, but by God's will. Even when everything seemed lost, even when the pain became unbearable, he knew he should not succumb to despair, but instead resist with firm faith, waiting for what God had in store for him. Job's silence was interrupted by the arrival of three figures who, like shadows from a distant past, appeared from afar. They were his friends, Eliphaz, Bildad, and Zophar. They had heard rumors about Job's suffering, the terrible losses he had experienced, and driven by a sense of compassion, they decided to travel to be by his side. Though their intentions were good, none of them knew exactly what to do or how to help in the face of such pain. Eliphaz, Bildad, and Zophar were respected men, with wisdom born of their life experiences. However, as they approached Job, none of them knew how to react. They saw him sitting in the ashes, covered in sores, a man who seemed like a shadow of what he had been. Their hearts tightened at the sight of what suffering had done to their friend, and for a moment, a shadow of silence fell over the group. None of the three spoke immediately. They approached cautiously, as if afraid that any wrong word could intensify the already present pain. What could be said to a man in such a deplorable state? What words could ease the tragedy he was living? They sat by his side, silently sharing the weight of Job's affliction, but not knowing how to lighten the burden. The friends remained with him for 7 days and 7 nights. During this time, they did not speak, not daring to utter a word. Job's suffering was so deep, and the silence became an expression of respect for the silent pain he bore. No one knew what to say. The sight of the man who had once been prosperous, respected, and successful, now marked by tragedy, left them paralyzed, speechless. The 7 nights passed as if time had stagnated. Throughout this period, Job remained in his place of suffering, with not a word of complaint, but also with no relief. His friends, though well-intentioned, were so bewildered by their friend's immeasurable suffering that they couldn't find a way to offer comfort. Job's pain was not something easy to handle, neither for him nor for those who cared for him. And it was in this silence, amid the pain and weight of an incomprehensible tragedy, that the true nature of Job's friendship would be put to the test. Words, which might have been a balm, were postponed, and what remained was a silent sharing of the pain. Job's suffering was not just in his body, but also in his soul, and his friends now faced the reality that the suffering of a righteous man could not be easily explained or understood. Days passed, but the tension remained. What would happen when the silence was broken? What more could be said or done? None of them knew, but for now, their presence was all they could offer. And even though words were absent, the fact that they were there, sharing in their friends' pain and anguish, spoke louder than any speech. The heavy silence that had permeated the 7 days was finally broken. It was Eliphaz, the eldest of the 3 friends, who took the initiative to speak. He approached Job with a grave look, but also with the intention of offering advice that he believed would be helpful. After observing his friend's condition and reflecting on what was happening, Eliphaz spoke with some caution, but at the same time, with confidence in his own wisdom. "Job," he began, his voice heavy with genuine concern, "we know you are a righteous man, a God-fearing man. But look at what is happening to you. The suffering you are facing is not a coincidence. God is just, and it is impossible for someone as faithful as you to suffer without reason. Is it not a punishment for something you've done? Perhaps you have sinned in secret, and God is correcting you." Eliphaz's words came as a shock to Job. The friend with whom he had shared so many battles was now suggesting that he was guilty of some sin. The accusation was veiled, but there was a tone of reproach in Eliphaz's words. He was implying that Job's suffering could not be without reason, that something inside him, some hidden error, must be the cause of his tragedy. Bildad, the second friend, quickly joined the conversation with a serious and slightly impatient look. "Eliphaz is right," he asserted, his tone more direct. "God would not punish a righteous man without reason. What happened to you cannot just be an accident. Sin has consequences, and you must repent, ask for God's forgiveness for what you may have done unknowingly. One cannot expect blessings when they sin against the Lord." Zophar, the third friend, who had been silent until now, spoke firmly, almost accusatorily. "What is happening to you, Job, is a reflection of something you have done, and as hard as it is, you must recognize that. God punishes the wicked, and if he is punishing you, it is because something in your life is not right. If you repent, perhaps the Lord will have mercy and restore your prosperity." The words of his friends were like sharp knives, cutting away the trust Job had in his own integrity. The suffering he was enduring was already unbearable, but now he found himself being accused, indirectly and sometimes directly, of being guilty of something he didn't even understand. Job felt the weight of the accusations fall on his shoulders, and his soul was torn apart even further. He didn't know how to explain his suffering, how to justify his faithfulness to God, who seemed to have abandoned him in such a cruel way. But above all, he knew there was no hidden sin in his heart, and the words of his friends were an additional blow, an unnecessary pressure he could not bear. He looked at the 3 men who had been his friends for so long, and with deep pain, responded, "How can you speak to me like this? Don't you see that I have done nothing to deserve all of this? Why does God afflict me this way if I am a righteous man? I don't know what happened, but I have nothing to hide. I've never sinned against him, and yet he has abandoned me." The accusation, the judgment, and the pressure on his shoulders became unbearable. Job's friends, with their good intentions and limited wisdom, could not see the complexity of his suffering. They tried to offer easy answers to something that had no simple explanation. They didn't understand that sometimes the suffering of a righteous man is not a reflection of his sin, but of something much deeper and more mysterious. Job, in his pain, questioned God's justice, but he did not see himself as guilty. He knew he was being misunderstood. His friends, in their attempt to help, ended up increasing Job's anguish, not realizing they were, in some way, perpetuating the suffering he already faced. The weight of the accusations and assumptions falling on him became an even heavier burden, and the gap between the reality of his suffering and his friends' understanding of it seemed to grow wider. Job, though exhausted and torn, rose with a strength that only intense pain can provide. The words of his friends, which might have been understood as advice at first, now seemed more like accusations. The subtleties of their assumptions weighed on him like an impossible burden. He felt the depth of the injustice in being judged for something he hadn't done, and with a heavy heart, his words emerged from a place of anguish and frustration. "How can you accuse me like this?" Job exclaimed, his voice trembling, not with anger but with despair. "I have not committed any sin. I did nothing to deserve this suffering. I am being treated like a wicked man, and all I have done is follow the path of righteousness. You know me. I never strayed from my commitment to God. Why am I now treated as though I were a criminal?" Job sat down again, his hands trembling, his gaze lost, trying to understand what had happened. He looked at his friends, searching for some kind of understanding, some sign that, at least among those who knew him so well, he would not be seen as a sinner. But what he found were faces reflecting more judgment than empathy, more doubt than support. "God, in his justice, would not punish an innocent man like me," Job continued, trying to find words to express the complexity of what he was going through. "Yes, I am a man who fears God. I have always tried to live righteously and honorably, and yet he has abandoned me. So why this suffering? Why this endless affliction?" He looked up at the sky as if searching for an answer in the heights, as if nature itself could bring some relief to his tormented soul. But the silence was deep, and the pain persisted. The distance between what he believed to be right and the cruel reality of his suffering seemed insurmountable. "You say I'm guilty of something, but you don't know what it is," he said, looking directly at his friends. "I don't know what I've done wrong, if I've done anything at all. If any mistake has been made, only God can reveal it to me, but so far, he remains silent. How can I repent for something I don't understand? How can I confess a sin I don't know I've committed?" Job felt the weight of his friend's misunderstanding, but more than that, he felt the growing tension of being pressured to find an explanation for something that had no explanation. Suffering was not something that could be easily solved with words or actions. He knew his friends were trying to help, but the way they approached his suffering seemed wrong. It was not a hidden sin that he needed to confess. It was an inexplicable pain he needed to understand, that he needed to live through, without constantly being accused. Job continued, his voice softer, more introspective. "I am a righteous man, and that's what hurts me the most. God knows this. He knows who I am, and if he allows me to continue living this pain, then let it be. But do not treat me as someone who deserves this. Do not see me as a sinner, for my soul remains clean before God." The silence that followed was heavy. Job's friends looked at him, but now there was a distance in their eyes. What had once seemed like a conversation of comfort, a search for answers, was now turning into a dispute, an attempt to understand why someone so righteous could suffer so much. Job, in turn, was lost in his own suffering, not understanding how he had ended up here, and finding no comfort in the words of those who had once been his allies. The debate grew increasingly bitter, as his friends insisted on a theological explanation for suffering, while Job found himself at an impasse, trying to find meaning in everything he was experiencing. He was being forced to confront the harsh reality that there are not always easy answers to human suffering, and that, no matter how much his friends tried to help, relief would not come from words, but from something much deeper and more mysterious. Job, now overwhelmed by even deeper suffering, felt increasingly distant from God. The words of his friends continued to weigh on his soul, and although he knew they were trying to help, he could not see in their words the comfort he so desperately sought. He was at a point of emotional and spiritual exhaustion, a crossroads where pain pushed him to question everything he had believed. "I need something more. I need someone who understands me," Job thought as he gazed at the horizon, where the sky met the earth, like a thin line between the visible and the invisible. His desire grew, an urgent need for someone to intervene, someone who could speak to God on his behalf, someone who could intercede for him. He felt as though his voice was unheard, as if his prayers did not cross the chasm that seemed to separate him from his Creator. "If only there were a mediator between me and God," he murmured, almost like a silent prayer. "Someone who could represent me, someone who could explain my pain, someone who could make God hear me." Job's longing for a mediator became clearer as he reflected on his situation. He knew that, in the face of God's greatness, He was just a mere man, fragile mortal. The chasm between them seemed impossible to cross. How could a man with so many doubts and afflictions stand before such a grand and perfect God? Job felt powerless and lost, like a leaf carried by the wind, with no direction or purpose. His thoughts took him even deeper into his quest for answers. If only I could speak with God as one speaks with a friend, he thought. If I could question him, expose my pain, without my humanity being an obstacle, maybe I could understand what he wants from me. But how can I reach the Almighty? How can I make him hear me? Job's desire for a mediator, someone who could represent his cause, consumed him. He thought of all the times he had offered sacrifices for his children, fearing they might sin unknowingly, and now he felt that he needed someone to intercede for him, just as he had interceded for others. The anguish of not being able to approach God directly made him feel even more isolated, further away from the answer he so longed for. If only there were someone, he sighed, someone who could take me to God, who could defend me, who could explain the reason for my suffering. Someone who understands my pain and can translate it to God in a way he can understand. It was an intense desire, a desperate need to find a link, a connection, that could restore balance between his pain and God's will. But no matter how much he tried, he could not imagine such a mediator. He felt as if he were trapped in a labyrinth of suffering, with no way out, no direction. Job then prostrated himself, in an act of surrender, accepting the distance between him and God, but without losing hope that someday, someone or something could help him cross that chasm. The thought of a mediator, someone who could be his voice before God, became the only comfort left to him. Perhaps in this desire lay the key to understanding his pain, an understanding he had not yet reached, but desperately wished for. Amid his pain and suffering, Job's thoughts began to turn toward the world around him, toward the injustice he perceived in the behavior of people. He observed the wicked, those who gave themselves to evil, who lived their lives without any fear of God, and yet seemed to prosper. Their hearts, corrupted, were far from righteousness, and still, they did not face the same trials he did. The injustice, to him, seemed clear. How can this be? He wondered, with a tone of silent indignation. The wicked, those who turn away from justice, who exploit others and ignore morality, prosper. They have riches, health, and a life full of pleasures, while I, who have always tried to do what is right, am punished for something I don't understand. Job could not understand why evil seemed to be rewarded and the righteous punished. He saw wicked men accumulating wealth dishonestly, deceiving others, harming the weak, and still, their lives were unshaken. They had everything, land, servants, happy families, while he, a man who had always sought to walk with God, was being stripped of everything he had. The contrast between the wicked and himself tormented him. He saw himself, in his suffering, living as a man abandoned by God, while those who turned away from righteousness were living without difficulty. They seemed immune to suffering, as if divine justice did not reach them. Why do the wicked have everything they want, and I am afflicted, even though I am righteous? He reflected, in a state of bewilderment. God, how can this happen? How can evil flourish while the righteous are destroyed? The images that passed through Job's mind were of men who took pride in their wealth and arrogance, men who mocked morality, who exploited others without remorse. They seemed invulnerable, their bodies healthy, their families united, their fields fertile. Injustice was in every detail, and Job, in his pain, felt like an exception to the rule. There's no logic, he murmured, bitterness in his voice. Where is the justice of God? Where is the reward for the righteous and the punishment for the wicked? What did I do wrong to deserve this? But as his thoughts deepened, Job began to notice something even more unsettling. He knew that, no matter how much the wicked prospered now, their lives were empty, and what they seemed to have achieved with their hands stained with sin couldn't be lasting. They lived as though they were above everything and everyone, as if they were immune to God's judgment. Yet, Job didn't forget the truth he knew. Evil may have its moment of triumph, but God's justice will one day be done. He felt the loneliness of his faith, but also the comfort that, in the end, divine truth would prevail. The prosperity of the wicked was, to him, an illusion, something that wouldn't withstand time. And he hoped that what he was going through, though cruel and misunderstood, was part of a greater purpose, something beyond his immediate understanding. I know that God's justice doesn't fail, he said to himself, his voice calm but firm. Though evil seems to prosper now, God will bring his judgment. The prosperity of the wicked will be brief, and the righteous, even in suffering, will find the truth. I believe in that. And so, Even amid his greatest doubts, Job found a kind of peace. He didn't have all the answers to his questions, but his heart was grounded in the trust that God's justice would one day manifest, and that his suffering, though incomprehensible in that moment, would not be in vain. Job no longer knew how to express the pain that gripped his body and soul. His days were endless, marked by a suffering that seemed never-ending. The loss of his wealth, his children, and the physical anguish of the wounds covering his body were no longer the only things tormenting him. Loneliness and inner emptiness had replaced what had once been his unwavering faith. He sat among the ashes, the remnants of his once prosperous life, and in his silence, sorrow became such a heavy weight that he could barely breathe. Sometimes, when the cold wind would strike his face, he felt a slight relief, as if nature was in some way acknowledging his pain. But soon that relief faded, and oppression returned with redoubled force. "Why am I here?" he asked repeatedly, his voice hoarse, almost a whisper. "Why does God allow me to live like this, in this sea of suffering? Why doesn't he take me away? If death is the end for me, why doesn't he take me now? What's left of me? Why am I alive if everything I've built, everything I loved, has been taken from me?" Loneliness felt like a weight he couldn't bear, but the thought that his pain had no purpose, that nothing made sense anymore, consumed him. He felt that if he had been born lifeless, at least he wouldn't have experienced the suffering that made him question his very existence. His eyes, once full of hope, were now empty of understanding, and his spirit, once strong, was now marked by exhaustion. "I wish I had never been born," he murmured, his heart tight. "Why did God bring me into the world just to abandon me like this? If my life was a mistake, why was it allowed? If my pain is my truth, then why was life given to me? What's good about surviving this torture? I am a man without answers, and all I see ahead of me is more darkness." With tears in his eyes, Job thought of his children, the joy he felt watching them grow. Now, nothing remained of his former life. Only pain, only loss. He knew that without their presence, his life was empty, and the absence of everything he loved made his heart even heavier. The longing, like an open wound, only grew worse each day. "If I had gone with them," he thought, "maybe now my pain would have ended. But I'm stuck here, between what I lost and what I don't yet know if I'll lose. And nothing remains for me." Job felt that words, even the most desperate, could not express what was happening in his heart. He wished that someone, even if not God, could understand what he was going through. Someone who would say that all of this would have some meaning, some end. He looked up at the sky, as if waiting for an answer that would never come. But the only thing he heard was the sound of the wind and the whisper of his own pain. The life he had known seemed so distant, so unreal, and the idea of a better future now seemed only like an illusion. "God, if there's still something good in my life, show me. If there's any purpose left, give me a reason to keep going. Because I can't do this anymore." Job surrendered to his pain, no longer expecting more than a silent response, without the hope that things would resolve easily. He simply wanted to understand why suffering had become his reality, and why, instead of finding peace, he saw himself sinking deeper into the shadows of his own existence. When Elihu entered the scene, young and passionate, his eyes were filled with a fire that couldn't be ignored. He had heard Job's conversations with his three friends, the heavy words and speeches about justice and suffering, and for some time, he remained silent. But now, finally, he could no longer hold back. He wasn't willing to let Job's old friends, with their narrow view, continue casting accusations that, in his view, were far from the truth. "Listen," Elihu said, his voice firm and determined. "I am young, but I am not blind to the truth. You've spoken a lot about Job's suffering, but you're missing the essential point. It's not his fault that brought him here, but something bigger, something that God is trying to teach." Job, exhausted and desperate for answers, looked at him with a mix of frustration and curiosity. He was no longer a man with an open mind, but rather someone who had been crushed by words and pain. Job's friends, who had tried everything to explain his affliction, were now being challenged by this young man with sharp words. Elihu wasn't just impetuous. He had a different idea about the cause of Job's suffering. To him, it wasn't about direct punishment, as the others had suggested, but something more subtle and deep. He believed that suffering could be a way through which God disciplined, taught, and ultimately purified hearts. "You say that Job must have sinned, and that's why he's suffering," Elihu continued, with a penetrating look. "But that's a limited view. Job's suffering may not be a punishment, but a divine test, an opportunity for him, and all of us, to see where we're failing in understanding God's purpose." Job, who had until then questioned God's justice, felt a new kind of restlessness rise within him. "How can you say that?" he asked, his voice low but filled with pain. "You accuse me of being a sinner, like the others. But I'm innocent. If my suffering isn't because of a mistake, why am I afflicted like this? What am I failing to see?" Elihu calmly responded, "I'm not saying that you've sinned directly, Job. What I'm saying is that God often uses suffering as a way to purify the soul, to refine character. It's a discipline that, in the end, leads to a deeper understanding of his will and his power." Job was silent for a moment, absorbing Elihu's words. It was a new perspective, and even though he was tired of hearing, there was something in the way the young man spoke that made sense, even if it didn't bring immediate comfort. "But what about my pain?" Job asked, his voice full of exasperation. "What good is what I'm going through? What does this teach me if all I see is loss, misery, and abandonment?" Elihu answered with serene clarity, "Pain can be the furnace where gold is purified, Job. God hasn't abandoned you. He's calling you to something greater, to a deeper understanding. He's not punishing you, but shaping you." While Elihu spoke, the tone of his voice was firm, yet at the same time, it was filled with a compassion that transcended any judgment. Job, still immersed in his pain, felt a slight shift, a subtle opening to the possibility that perhaps his tragedy was not a divine mistake, but an invitation to something greater that he could not yet comprehend. The days passed, and the storm of words between Job and his friends had left everyone exhausted. Job, in his pain, no longer knew whom to turn to. His questions had become a constant, like an echo that would not cease, an unrelenting search for answers that seemed impossible to reach. But then, something surprising happened. From the midst of the storm, when the earth was silent and the wind seemed to have stopped, God's voice emerged. It was a deep voice, filled with power and authority, but also with mystery and vastness. Job sat, as always, amidst the ashes, his body covered with sores, his thoughts fragmented. And then God spoke. "Who is this that obscures my plan with words without knowledge?" God asked, and the question reverberated in Job's heart, as if the earth itself were asking. Job, astonished, could not grasp the magnitude of what was happening. The sound of God's voice seemed to echo not just in the air, but in his soul. It was impossible to ignore the vastness of that moment. God continued, each word like thunder tearing through the silence and darkness of Job's mind. "Where were you when I laid the foundations of the earth? Tell me if you have understanding, who determined its measurements, or who stretched the line upon it?" With each question, Job felt smaller, more insignificant in the face of the grandeur of the cosmos, the complexity of the universe, and divine wisdom. God was asking about creation, about the course of the stars, the oceans, the depths of the earth, and Job, speechless, found himself consumed by the immensity of what he could not understand. "Who set limits for the sea," God continued, and said, "This far you shall come, and no farther? Who did this, if not I?" Job fell silent. God's words pierced him like arrows of truth that he could never contest. He, a small man, limited by his finite view of life, now stood before infinite wisdom that could not be explained by pain or reason. "Do you know," God asked with a voice that seemed to penetrate the very depths of being, "where the dawn's light dwells, or where the fog is hidden? Tell me, if you can understand." The words were not accusatory, but they were challenging in a way that made Job feel even more humble. He began to realize that the issue was not his pain, nor his suffering. It was his understanding of what the universe truly was, and the divine plan that lay beyond his human capacity. And while God spoke, Job felt the weight of his own questions disappear, not because answers had come, but because he understood that not all answers could be given. Not all questions could be answered with mere human words. Job, with a heavy heart, understood the vastness of God and the limitation of his own vision. In his speech, God was showing Job that suffering was not to be understood immediately, that not everything in the universe fit into the molds of human justice. But there was a greater purpose, one that transcended pain and suffering, one that could only be grasped through humility before God's greatness. Job, enveloped by that divine wisdom, now knew that the true answer to his questions was not in reason, but in the acceptance that there were things beyond his understanding. And by accepting this, he felt his soul quieted, as if a supernatural peace surrounded him. At this moment, before the immensity of God and creation, Job found a new kind of understanding, not of explanations, but of trust. When God's voice fell silent and the echo of divine wisdom dissipated, a deep silence took hold of Job. He was now before something far greater than any pain, any suffering, or even his answers. The pride that had once driven him to question God now faded, like the heat of a fire cooling after a storm. The man who had once seen himself as just and deserving of answers now saw himself as a creature before the Creator, utterly incapable of comprehending the magnitude of what God had done, does, and will continue to do. Job, with a broken heart, finally spoke. His words came from a place of total humility, as one who had realized the limited extent of his own wisdom. "I had heard of you by the hearing of the ear," he said, "but now my eyes see you. Therefore, I despise myself and repent in dust and ashes." Job's words reflected the depth of his inner transformation. He was no longer concerned with justifying his pain or understanding every detail of his suffering. He simply surrendered to the greatness of God. Job's repentance was not merely for questioning, but for a deep understanding of his own limitation. He recognized that, even as a man who feared God, he had sought human answers where only trust and faith could exist. By accepting his insignificance before divine greatness, Job found peace. Not peace because he had found the answers, but peace because he had found a new understanding. That trusting in God was more valuable than trying to understand all the mysteries of life. After Job's profound humiliation and repentance, something extraordinary began to happen. God, in his infinite mercy, not only heard Job's words, but also saw the sincerity of his transformed heart. Those who had accused him, the friends who had argued so much about his condition, were now silent, with no words to respond to what God had declared about his greatness and wisdom. God then turned to Job's friends and rebuked them, making it clear that they had spoken wrongly about him and about Job. "My servant Job will pray for you," God said, "and I will forgive you." Job, with a truly humble heart, accepted to intercede for them, despite all the accusations he had endured. This act of forgiveness and intercession demonstrated the depth of his internal transformation. Not only had he been restored, but he also had the opportunity to restore his friends before God. Finally, God blessed Job once more. His possessions, which had been taken, were returned to him twofold. The cattle, the land, the wealth, and everything he had lost were multiplied. Moreover, God blessed him with a new family. Sons and daughters were born to him, and Job lived a long life, seeing the children of his children to the 4th generation. Job's restoration was not only material but spiritual. He had learned true trust in God, and, with that, experienced a blessing that surpassed everything he had before. Job's restoration was not limited to wealth or health, but also extended to his family life. When his sons and daughters were born, the gleam in his eyes reflected a joy he never imagined he would feel again. After the tragedy, the suffering, and the loss that had deeply marked his soul, God gave him a new chance to experience paternal love. Job now had a new family, and the pain of losing his previous children, though it never fully disappeared, was softened by the blessing of a renewed life. The children who were born to Job were described as the most beautiful in all the land. Job's daughters, in particular, were remarkable. They received an inheritance alongside their brothers, something uncommon at that time, a demonstration of the dignity that God had bestowed upon them and the reverence that Job had for them. He loved them deeply, and the fact that his daughters were treated with such honor indicated the new era beginning in Job's life, an era where he no longer saw the losses, but the new blessings that God had given him. Job's children grew with wisdom and respect. They lived together in harmony, and Job witnessed God's grace in his family life. As the family gathered around him, Job reflected on God's goodness, how he, in his infinite mercy, had turned his sorrow into joy. The man who had lost everything, who had been at the depths of suffering, was now blessed with a new generation to care for, teach, and love. God had given him more than he could have ever imagined. The story of Job, marked by intense moments of pain and loss, teaches a profound lesson about human suffering. During his darkest periods, Job had wondered why he, a righteous man, should suffer so intensely. But at the end of his journey of anguish, he realized that suffering was not a punishment, but a means of purification and spiritual transformation. He had been brought to a point where his understanding of God, the universe, and his own faith had been refined. It was no longer about wealth or health. It was about the depth of his trust in God, regardless of circumstances. Job learned that suffering can have a greater purpose than what we are able to see. His pain, though overwhelming, led him to a deeper and truer relationship with God. He came to understand that true faith does not depend on material blessings or prosperity, but on unwavering trust in God's character, even when life challenges us in inexplicable ways. Job's suffering purified him, strengthened him, and shaped him into a man of deeper, stronger faith and closer to God. Job's lesson is not just about understanding suffering, but about how it transforms us. Suffering, in many forms, can challenge us, but it also teaches us to depend more on God and trust in His sovereignty. The true victory, as Job discovered, is not the absence of pain, but the ability to maintain faith and trust in God, even in the most difficult situations. And it is through this faithfulness that the purpose of suffering is revealed. It leads us to a place of greater understanding, humility, and above all, trust in the Lord. The story of Job reveals that divine justice goes beyond human understanding. During his suffering, Job sought answers as to why he was in pain, trying to understand why God would allow a righteous man to go through such affliction. He believed that, by being faithful to God, he deserved to be protected from calamities. But throughout his journey, he was confronted with the reality that God's justice cannot be measured by human standards, and that understanding His actions transcends logic and reason. When God responded to Job, He didn't directly explain the reason for his suffering, but He made him understand that his view of justice was limited. The questions God asked Job about creation and the cosmos were an invitation for him to recognize his smallness in the face of the vastness of the divine plan. God's justice is not based on a simple and immediate retribution of good deeds, as many believe, but is part of a perfect divine plan, one that often goes beyond human comprehension. This revelation about divine justice teaches us that, even when we face pain and apparent injustice in our lives, we must trust that God works according to a greater purpose, one that is often beyond our reach. True divine justice is not a simple exchange of merits and punishments, but an action aimed at the greater good, divine wisdom, and the redemption of all. Sometimes we are called to trust in His justice, even when we don't understand His ways, and to accept that His plan is perfect, even when it seems incomprehensible. The story of Job transcends the centuries, becoming an eternal lesson about patience, faith, and perseverance in the face of life's trials. In the midst of unbearable suffering, Job not only endured, but also learned and grew spiritually. His story is not just an account of affliction, but a living example of how faith in God can be held firm, even when everything around us falls apart. Job's lesson is not about understanding all the reasons for suffering, but about how we can find strength and grace to continue believing, even without clear answers. Job became a symbol of resilience. By questioning God, yet at the same time maintaining his faith, he teaches us that it's okay to seek answers and wrestle with our doubts, as long as we never abandon our trust in God. His journey shows us that faith is not a path free of difficulties, but a continuous process of trusting and resting in God's promises, even when everything seems lost. Job's patience, his willingness to submit to God's sovereignty, is a lesson in how we should face moments of crisis and pain with courage and humility. Job's testimony resonates as a call to all of us. True faith is not based on our circumstances, but on our relationship with God. What Job teaches us is that, even in the darkest of nights, God is present, working in us and for us. His story challenges us to keep our trust in God, even when we cannot see the purpose of our struggles. And in the end, Job experienced redemption not only physically, but spiritually, showing that perseverance in faith brings an eternal reward that goes beyond human understanding. And so we come to the end of Job's story, a powerful lesson about patience, faith, and the purpose of suffering. If you've been touched by this journey of transformation and overcoming, share in the comments what impacted you the most in this story. Did you enjoy the video? Don't forget to leave your like to show that this content made a difference for you. And if you haven't subscribed yet, subscribe now so you don't miss more inspiring stories and life lessons like this one. Hit the bell to receive notifications and stay up to date with all the content we've prepared with so much care for you. Thank you for being here, and see you in the next video.